And as a result, 40 years ago this month, a modern-day movement for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender equality was born. Now, as successful as that movement has been, judging it by any measure, it is still a wonder that we are in the place we're in today, particularly when you think about the obstacles and the hurdles that we have faced. In the 70s, in the aftermath of Stonewall, we saw the rise of what they called at the time the moral majority. It is now commonly referred to as the radical right, or a number of other things. Take your pick. At its height, what is important to remember is that Jerry Falwell's group, which was at the time called the Moral Majority, was the largest conservative lobbying group in the country with 4 million members. In the 1970s, they had 4 million members. Layer onto that Pat Robertson, who founded the Christian Broadcasting Network, James Dobson, Focus on the Family, the Family Research Council, and you begin to see the weaving together of a telegenic group of religious conservatives who warned over and over again on television, on the radio, and before Congress that homosexuality would bring down the American family, including anyone in our movement. And remember, this was before we were even having a conversation about same-sex marriage. Then, in the early 80s, Time magazine and other news outlets began reporting on what they called a gay cancer. It would, in short order, take on a lot of other names and acronyms, but it would ultimately be known as the AIDS epidemic. And it would shatter almost an entire generation of gay and bisexual men. And for over a decade, for an entire decade, until there was the creation of AIDS service organizations and advocacy groups and government involvement. For a decade, every organization and every person in our community did nothing except fight to keep people alive. That's all we did, nothing else. Everyone was dying, nobody was paying attention, and again, we found ourselves alone. Even President Reagan, who would lose his good friend Rock Hudson to AIDS, wouldn't even say the word, let alone react in a responsible way to this national and ultimately global tragedy. But as we had done before, we found our power and we fought. Some of us lobbied Congress and the American people to respond in a more humane way, and others, like true frontline heroes in organizations like ACT UP, they literally chained themselves across the Brooklyn Bridge. They put their damaged bodies in the middle of the street and they stopped traffic in a plea for the American people to simply look. Stop and look at what is happening to us, to your sons, to your coworkers, to your neighbors, to your brothers and sisters. Stop and look. Now, it's also important here to remember that for 24 of the last 40 years, we have been led by presidents who either did not support any measure of gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender equality, or, like the second President Bush, who actively worked against us by trying not once but twice to enshrine discrimination into the Constitution in the form of the Federal Marriage Amendment. In the early 80s, we thought that we had finally turned a corner. A new president, a man from Hope, Arkansas, who promised to take us over that bridge to the 21st century, gave us a glimmer of hope too. But the times and the resistance he faced overcame Bill Clinton's political will. Congress changed in a landslide 2 years later, and we were left with Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the Defense of Marriage Act. Just when we thought we might be moving forward, it felt like we were moving back again. And in 1994, until 3 years ago, we lived under congressional leadership whose unspoken policy, or oftentimes spoken policy, was to never, ever advance one single measure of equality for our community. So over these years, organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, we did what we could to build an army of activists who would slowly lay a foundation for change in our elected leadership. We've done the work by lobbying, by sharing the stories of our lives to anyone who would listen. We built a strong volunteer infrastructure in places like Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati and other major cities across the country. But as we worked to become a powerful force for change in American politics and ultimately helped change the face of leadership in this country, we continued to understand something fundamental, that we would have to do this, at least in the foreseeable future, by ourselves, that we would have to find more immediate and creative ways to change the experience for members of the LGBT community. And so nearly a decade ago, we adopted a strategy like none other, one that would ultimately impact public policy, but that would improve the lives of our community immediately. At the Human Rights Campaign, we took stock of just where these inequities were happening. In what institutional settings would we find them? And then we went there, and we got about the business of working to erase those inequities for our community. And our first stop was the place where more Americans congregate more often than any place else, the American workplace. In 2002, the Human Rights Campaign began approaching corporate America about creating a more equitable work environment. We began and we ended the conversation not by talking about what was the right thing to do, but rather by making the business case for diversity, by reminding potential corporate allies that the more diverse, welcoming, and equitable they were willing to make their workplace, the more talented and satisfied their workforce would be. We told corporate America that we were going to rate the job they did, that it would be a way for us to measure the success we were making, but a way for them to be accountable to the work that they were doing, and for the community to evaluate workplace as well as consumer decision-making. In 2002, our first year of rating corporations under what we call the Corporate Equality Index, we gave 13 Fortune 500 companies a perfect 100% score. This year, we have awarded that 100% score to nearly 250 of the Fortune 500 companies. And over the course of the past 7 years, we have raised the bar not once, but twice in terms of what we've asked those companies to do in order to reach that perfect 100%. And Ohio has much to be proud of in this regard. As I mentioned, KeyBank is a 100% company, as is Nationwide Insurance, who not only scores a 100%, but whose leadership testified in Congress to try and pass the non-discrimination bill. Procter & Gamble, which recently added gender identity to its non-discrimination policy. Owens Corning, Abercrombie & Fitch, not surprising. And the Cleveland law firm of Squires, Sanders, and Dempsey, all companies here in Ohio scoring a perfect 100%. So when people ask me, what have you done to move the American people towards a fuller understanding and level support for LGBT issues, I always point to projects like this one. Why? Because increasingly, as I spend more time in corporate and public settings, speaking to largely LGBT audiences, I find myself engaged in conversations with straight people who tell me everything they had previously thought about gay or transgender Americans changed when someone at work, or when someone who steps up to the hospital admitting desk, or when someone in their congregation comes out to them. All of a sudden, the abstract concept that they had held about gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people, about same-sex marriage, it comes right up against a real person with a real story and a real name. Today, we've taken this work that we've done with corporate America and we've brought it to America's hospitals in a project called the Healthcare Equality Index. We're taking it to colleges and universities and any other setting where the American people find themselves. And right here in Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic not only participated in the health survey, but they've gone the extra mile. Seeing some gaps in presenting a welcoming setting for LGBT people and their families in need of care, they're actively working internally and with HRC to further improve the level and care and respect for their patients there.